Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to review the AYANEO Pocket Air Mini. Now there's a very unique thing about this device when it comes to AYANEO. Often they will make more premium and expensive handhelds, but this one is dirt cheap by comparison. It's between $70 and $80 depending on the spec that you get. I'm not sure what's going on with this company. Maybe they've had some sort of existential crisis, but as it stands, the last few handhelds they have made have been really impressive, and this one is right up there with the rest of them. It's almost like we're in a Goldilocks scenario. They've spent the past 5 or 6 years really tuning in their controls and overall feel, and this one kind of takes all of those elements but then offers it at a price that we've never seen before. And so even though this is the very first truly budget handheld they've ever made that comes in well under $100, it feels like something that's a lot more expensive. They're also using a hefty processor with enough power to play through your favorite classics up through Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and so on with an upscaled resolution. It caps out at around the GameCube and PS2 era, so you're not going to be able to play all of those games, but you might be surprised what this little guy can do for this price point. As you can imagine, we've got a lot to talk about, so grab your favorite snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's talk about what we have under the hood. So first off, we have the Helio G9T as its processor. And this is an 8-core CPU. We will do a bunch of performance testing later in this video. They're offering 2 different specs, and that will determine how much RAM and internal storage you get, but it is quite low. So the $70 model is 2 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of storage, and then the $80 model will be 3 gigs of RAM and 64 gigabytes of storage. So this is probably one of the cost-cutting measures that they did. They did keep this to minimum specs. The display on here is decent for the price, 4.2 inches, a 960p resolution, and a 4:3 aspect ratio. It's an LCD panel, it only gets up to 60 Hz, so it's not like groundbreaking in any way, but I do appreciate the fact that they used a higher resolution. The battery on this is also decent for its size, 4,500 milliamp hours, and it's also capable of doing an 18-watt power delivery charge. And while we're here, let's just go ahead and talk about battery life. I did a few different tests here to give you an idea of what it's going to look like. In a best case scenario, I played something lightweight like Super Nintendo in just 50% brightness here, and with no shaders or anything running, I got a little bit under 8 hours of game time. From there, you can extrapolate that lightweight emulation, things like Game Boy and Super Nintendo and whatnot, will give you around 8 hours and maybe a little bit more of battery. In the middle tier, I played Nintendo 64 using RetroArch, but again upscaled to a 960p resolution, and here I got a little bit under 7 hours of gameplay time. So if you're looking to play, kind of your mid-range systems, I think that's what you should expect. Now, surprisingly, the easiest way I found to drain the battery was to go back to playing Super Nintendo, but to use a heavy-duty shader. So in this regard, I used the CRT Geom shader, and that gave me a little bit over 4 hours of game time. So long story short, I would expect between 4 and 8 hours of gameplay depending on what you are running on your device, and I think that is pretty decent. Now the device is relatively small, but it's still pretty hefty and solid feeling. It's 269 grams, or about 9.5 ounces. As far as connectivity, we've also got a pretty good spec layout here, 5 GHz Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 5.0, and it does have a 3.5mm headphone jack, something that we don't see in a lot of more expensive AYANEO models. It's also running Android 11 as its operating system, and it has Hall sensor analog triggers and joysticks. Right now it's in a pre-order phase, and so the pricing is $70 and $80, but it'll go up from there around $75 at some point in the early bird price, and then at retail it'll go to $90 and $100. So it really depends on which model you're looking for and the timing of when you see this video and if you were to order it, but I'm just going to consider this to be a sub $100 handheld. Now right now they're collecting pre-orders on Indiegogo, but it is a little bit odd because Indiegogo just did a revamp of their website and a lot of things have changed. Beyond just the look and feel of the website, the way that you add your pledge is a little bit different now too. So you add in your pledge, but you don't pay until the end of the campaign. As a result, they don't even collect the shipping until the end of the campaign as well, so I'm not sure how much shipping is going to cost. At least according to what I've read, it should be around $20 for 4PX shipping, but you also have the option for FedEx and DHL, but that will be more expensive. And apparently, if you use anything but 4PX, you will run the risk of running into tariffs as well. So I'm just going to consider it to be around $20 shipping, at least in the minimum spec. There are 3 different color options, but the third color option, the Retro Power one, is only available for the higher spec 3GB model one. So this one's going to cost you at least $80 compared to $70 with the other 2 colors. And for me personally, I think it's well worth an additional $10 to double your storage in particular, as well as have additional RAM. I don't think that having 3GB versus 2GB of RAM is going to help when it comes to emulation, but it will help when it comes to navigating the menu and just the overall feel of your Android system. That being said, I am reviewing the 2GB lower spec model here today, so you'll see just through the performance in general that yes, it's working just great even at that lower spec model. So let's take a look at the device itself, and of note, this was sent over by the company for review, but like with all my videos, they're not going to see this ahead of time, all opinions are my own, and they are not paying me for this review in any way. Inside the box, it is very bare bones. We've got the device itself and a USB-C charging cable, and that's it. And first impressions is that this device feels really nice in the hands, like it is a high quality handheld. If I was just handed this, I would expect it to be maybe about $150 or so. So it's about half the price that I would expect. The plastic has a nice texture to it as well. It's slightly soft feeling and somewhat matte. And so I like the overall feel of this in my hands. And one of the first things I noticed is that it looks like a mini version of the AYANEO Pocket Air, which is apropos given the fact that that's its name. And yes, you can see that this device here came out a couple years ago, and it has a very similar design, but there are some distinctions. It still has that same off-white and red coloring to it, especially on the D-pad and face buttons, but there are some differences, like the cross pad on the D-pad or the lettering on the face buttons. Those are all different too. The analog sticks still have that same cigarette smoke style color to them, but they are way different. The original one had that Nintendo Switch Joy-Con feel to them, which I always felt was really limiting, but they have the new style sticks on the new one, which is those Hall sensor sticks that have that full range of motion, and you can also pull off the caps and replace them, just like you've seen with other AYANEO devices. So I really like this whole setup. I think the new plastic texture is a lot better than the old one too, which was really kind of sleek and smudgy, and so I didn't really like the feel of this old one, and I think it's been fixed with the new one. In terms of size and design, it reminds me a lot of the Retroid Pocket Mini. This is a $200 device here, but it has an AMOLED display and a more powerful processor, but very similar just in terms of the fact that they are both D-pad centric, but they have those same style sticks on both of them, and they both have like ergonomic bumps on the back as well. And so I think just in terms of overall design, these are very similar. The AYANEO Pocket Air is slightly wider, but that also makes sense because the screen is larger with 4.2 inches and a 4:3 aspect ratio, which makes it a little bit wider than on the Retroid Pocket Mini. So in general, I think they did a good job of making this still look pretty compact and comfortable. The device is also relatively thin, all things considered. It's got these ergonomic bumps on the back, which are very comfortable, but don't stick out too much. And then also we have these analog sticks, which really don't protrude that much either. And so in general, I found this to be a relatively pocketable handheld. It kind of feels like a thick and old school style cell phone. And so as long as you're okay with putting like a cell phone with a big case in your pocket, this should be right at home. So yes, I would consider this device to be pocketable. Obviously, it depends on the type of pants and pockets that you're using, but yes, this is a relatively compact handheld. So overall, I think it's a pretty good design. We've got these D-pad-centric controls, a relatively large screen given the size of the handheld, and it's still relatively compact, but comfortable and ergonomic. Let's talk about the controls. We'll start with the D-pad. So this has a rubber membrane connection, much like more classic D-pads, and it feels good. It's nice and bouncy, it doesn't bottom out or anything, and it's got a fair amount of pivot to it. One of the main things I like to test is sensitivity, and the first thing I like to do is try the contra test. So I like to press down on the D-pad, then rock it left and right, and see whether or not the character moves when I lightly move it. And I would say that in the spectrum of sensitivity, this is on the range of being less sensitive than more, and I think that's a good thing. That means that you're not going to get accidental diagonals when playing certain precise games. So when playing a game like Contra or Tetris or any of those where you don't want to hit a diagonal when you don't want to, this is going to be a pretty good fit. On the other side of the spectrum, there are games where you want to hit a diagonal easily. For example, a Street Fighter or Capcom-style fighting game. When you're trying to pull off a Hadouken or Shoryuken, it's important to be able to hit the diagonal as well. It took me a couple minutes to get used to just the overall feel of this D-pad, but once I got it down, maybe 2 or 3 rounds, yeah, this was feeling great. So I think this is a pretty good D-pad in terms of just dialing in that sensitivity. So long story short, yeah, I think this is a pretty good D-pad, especially for a handheld that's focused on retro gaming. Next, we have the analog sticks. I already mentioned that they are Hall sensor and they have a nice wide range of motion to them, and I think they are good. And in terms of testing, yeah, it feels very accurate to me. I'm able to move the cursor in any direction that I want to. There's no cardinal snapping. It does have a circular input, but everything else seems to be very nice. So in terms of getting a true analog input in those systems that had a stick like this, for example, Nintendo 64, yes, it feels very accurate and easy to use. And it is worth noting the analog sticks do light up. They have RGB lighting. You can change them to whatever color and pattern you have in the software here. To be honest, I have just left them off, but if you do want to use a different color with your device, you can definitely do that. Let's talk about the face buttons next. So these have a rubber membrane connection like a classic controller, and they also have a good amount of travel to them and they don't bottom out or anything. And I also like the fact that they are very light to the touch. They're easy to press down on, but they're also relatively quiet and solid in their place. They don't like wiggle around or anything. And so overall, I think these are good face buttons. They're a little bit small and they're also kind of close compact to one another, much like other smaller handhelds. But in general, I think these are better buttons than what we've seen from many other handhelds this year. Other than that, we've got our menu buttons. So select and start on the left, and then an AYANEO button, which will bring up their menu. And then also we have this button, which can be programmed to be like a back button or a home button, whatever you would like. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the placement of the start and select buttons down here, just because I think they're pretty vital buttons, but they're kind of hard to reach and it's a little bit awkward. It makes it hard to use them for RetroArch hotkeys as well. For example, I like to press start and select to exit out of a game, but in this case, what I usually have it set to is select and then R3 to exit out of a game, which is just a little bit awkward. I would prefer to have my start and select up here. But otherwise, I think that the whole face setup is good. All the buttons are easy to access and everything is very comfortable. Like with any other D-pad centric game, it's a little bit awkward to use it for twin stick style games. So first person shooter games or more modern games. This is just a little bit awkward because you have them both down below, but not the same leverage like you would on a PlayStation controller, which has like full ergonomic grips. So this is probably the only time where the control scheme feels a little bit less than ideal, but it's the same with any D-pad centric device. Okay, up top, we've got our volume up and down, our power button, which also works for sleep. And then we have two programmable buttons right here. And so these can be mapped in the software as well. Now, the shoulder buttons are some of my favorite on this device. They've got a really light touch to them, so they're easy to press down on, but they're also very quiet too. And so this is probably an ideal for me, the fact that they are light, but then also quiet. The analog triggers are also excellent. I like the design of them. They feel very good to kind of rest your index fingers on, and they also have a good amount of travel to them and don't have too much resistance either. And so in general, I think that these shoulders and triggers are ideal. On the back, we've got our cooling. So an active fan here with the intake and the exhaust, and this fan is very, very quiet. If you put it on the high mode, which is what I use most of the time, it actually is nearly silent. I have to put my ear against the speaker to even hear that something is happening. Even if you put it in the max mode, it is still very, very quiet, to the point where I didn't even do any audio testing because my mic couldn't really pick it up. On the bottom, we've got a micro SD card slot, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and then a USB-C port. Of note, this can charge your device, but it will not give you video out. And I believe that's a limitation of this chipset, not necessarily the device itself. And so yes, unfortunately, you're not able to consoleize this device to be able to play it on a big screen TV unless you wanted to like screencast or something like that, which you could definitely do because this is an Android-based device. Of note, when charging the device, we have a little LED indicator. On most Android devices from AYANEO, they don't have an LED light like this, and so I thought it was worth noting. Other than that, on the bottom, we've got our two stereo speakers. Let's do a quick audio test. Now, this is a sub $100 handheld, so I don't have super high expectations, and it is slightly muffled, but still relatively clear. Let me give you a listen just here in the stock profile. So in terms of volume and clarity, I would say it's about on par with other devices at this price point, in that, yes, it gets very loud, but it does have a slight muffled quality to them. It's obvious that these are not the best speakers in the world. Now, one of the benefits of AYANEO pumping out so many devices all the time is that we have the benefit of the software development work that's been done on their other devices. So for example, with this Android build, we have the ability to go into the settings and make an audio equalizer profile. So if you don't like the sound out of the box of the speakers, you can tune them yourself. And that's one of the better things that you can find in the AYANEO software. You often cannot find that with other devices. Now let's talk about the display. Like I mentioned already, it's 4.2 inches, 4:3 aspect aspect ratio and a resolution of 1280 by 960. That's going to be a 2x scale with many 480p systems like Dreamcast and some PlayStation and Nintendo 64. I think the colors here are pretty darn good. They're not super saturated like an OLED, but still you can see a nice distinction between like the blues and the reds and the greens here. And so overall, I think it looks pretty good, and the color temperature looks just about right for me. The display gets up to 500 nits brightness, which I think is pretty good. Right now we're at 50% brightness, and that's generally where I've been playing it indoors. This is what it looks like at 100% brightness, and you can see that it is starting to blow out near the sun and whatnot. So it does get quite bright. Again, about 500 nits total. It's bright enough to be able to use outdoors, but I would recommend using it in a shady environment. When you go into direct sunlight, it's a little bit harder to see what's going on the screen, but still visible. So I would say it is an outdoor-friendly device, but I would prefer to play it in the shade. Another nice thing about this display is that it gets very dark. This is at 0% brightness, and it's almost impossible to see what's on the screen. So that means to me that this is going to be pretty good when it comes to playing in an indoor, very dark environment, like playing in bed. When you combine that with the fact that all the buttons are relatively quiet, yes, this is probably a device you could play next to your sleeping significant other. So in the end, I really do like the design of the AYANEO Pocket Air Mini. I think it's comfortable to hold. It's got nice high quality plastic to it. All of the controls are easy to use. And yeah, it just feels like a device that's more expensive than it actually is. I would have guessed that this is about twice of its actual price if I just held the hardware alone. So if you are looking for something that's compact and ergonomic, but still feels very high quality, it's pretty crazy that this thing comes in at under $100. Okay, now let's talk about the software, and there's no surprises here. This is an Android-based system, and it has the same AYANEO Android software build that we've seen over the past couple years. Out of the box, it's only going to come with some essential apps, so you'll have to go into the Google Play Store and install your emulators and then load up your games, either with the internal storage or with the microSD card slot. Now, given the fact that the internal storage here is limited to 32 or 64 gigabytes, depending on the model that you get, you're probably going to put all of your games on the microSD card as opposed to trying to put anything on the internal storage. When it comes to settings, you've got a couple different options. You can just go into the regular Android settings and then make adjustments in here like you would with any other smartphone or tablet. But they've also got their own settings app called AYA Settings, and within here you can make more adjustments that are dedicated to the device itself. In the Performance tab, you can change out your profile, so I have 4 different options here: Eco, Balance, Gaming, and Max. For the most part, I just keep it in gaming with the high fan, and then if I'm going to really try to push it, like PS2 or GameCube, then I will put it on Max, but otherwise I just kind of keep it in gaming. In the controller section, you can adjust your RGB lights, your joystick calibration, and this is where you can set your custom keys as well. And under Device, this is where I go to change out the audio profile in the equalizer settings. So you've got quite a few different options here to make some adjustments that are specific to this device. Also, at any time, you can press the AYANEO button, which will bring up their quick menu. So here you can change out your performance and fan modes. You can also make adjustments to your controller, and then also do things like adjust your brightness and volume and RGB lighting. So for the most part, you can do almost everything you need to with the AYANEO button instead of having to go into the settings. Now, like with most of my other Android devices, I've just been using Emulation Station Desktop Edition as my front end. And so you can choose to set this as your home launcher. It'll just go right into this directly. And this will allow you to navigate through your different systems and then boot them from here. I'm currently using this theme called Compendium, which gives me a nice tile style interface, and I really enjoy this. I can go through and then navigate through my systems like this, and if I hover over a game for a moment, it'll start up a video. And so just in general, this is how I've been browsing through my games. You've got a ton of different themes with the Emulation Station. I've got a starter guide that will walk you through the whole process. I will leave it linked down below. But in general, this is basically how I've been using my AYANEO device, is that I've had it launching into Emulation Station, which then allows me to navigate through my systems, and that's basically about it. I treat it very simply, and that's what I like about it. Okay, now let's talk about performance, and I think this is really the sweet spot of the AYANEO Pocket Air Mini, because the hardware on this is good, and I think it is better than its price point may suggest, but it's the performance that really sets it apart. When you think about a device that's going to be under $100, most of the time you're going to be thinking about the cheap stuff, like an Anbernic handheld, which will reliably play up to like PS1 games, but gets pretty wonky after that. And I think this one is at a higher tier of that, because the AYANEO is going to be able to play those higher level systems, things like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, PSP. All those are actually going to run really well here. It's going to cap out at around GameCube and PS2. So let's dive in and show what everything looks like. Now, starting with the most lightweight stuff, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, these are going to run absolutely fine. Throw on an LCD grid shader, and this is going to look great. These systems ran at a 10:9 aspect ratio, which is going to give you about 3.8 inches of screen real estate. Now, you are going to get larger black borders on the left and right because this is a more narrow aspect ratio, but I still think it looks pretty good on a compact device like this. Game Boy Advance is going to be a very similar experience, but this is a wider aspect ratio. It is 3:2, so you will have black bars to the top and bottom, but you still have 4 inches of screen real estate altogether. This is a 5.7x scale of the original system. And because we have a 960p resolution screen to work with, even if you don't use integer scaling, I think that the pixels look relatively balanced. You've got other tricks you can use, like special shaders, to balance this even more, but as it stands, even out of the box, I think it looks really good. But I do think this handheld really shines with classic 4:3 systems, those that will take up the full 4.2 inches of this display and have that 4:3 aspect ratio. And so this primarily, I think, is where the device will really come into play. Everything through Nintendo and Super Nintendo and Genesis, all those 8-bit, 16-bit systems are going to look awesome on here, and they're going to fit perfectly. It's going to be the same thing when it comes to 4:3 oriented arcade games as well, which is going to be the vast majority of them. And so if you want to play any of these classic titles, you'll be able to do that right here, no problem. And this is where the additional performance power of that chipset will really come into play, because some of the more heavy-hitting arcade games like Killer Instinct actually play at full speed. And this to me is an excellent experience. I love Killer Instinct, and it's hard to run on a lot of these cheaper systems. And so to be able to play that on a 4.2-inch display with a 960p resolution, I think it looks awesome. Once you move into the 3D era, like PS1 and beyond, this is where things get very interesting, because most of these games will use 3D polygons, which can be upscaled internally in the emulator, and we've got a high resolution display, which means that we can play these games in 960p. So not only will it match the aspect ratio of the screen, so it's going to look great, but you can sharpen it as much as you would like as well, and things like PS1 are going to play at full speed even when you upscale. It's a similar story with Nintendo 64, but I found once you get to here and beyond, it gets a little bit more hit and miss, especially if you're only going to be using the RetroArch cores. For example, I found that the standalone Mupen 64 plus FC emulator actually does a better job. And so instead of jumping back and forth between RetroArch and the standalone emulator, I just decided to boot everything through the standalone emulator. Now, this is going to cause an issue if you are using retro achievements, because this standalone emulator doesn't have support for them. But if you don't mind that, then I think this will just be a more smooth experience overall. You might run into a couple emulation accuracy issues with this emulator, and you may have to change out the core within it. But for the most part, yeah, everything was very plug and play. And the performance is definitely there. If we take a really hard to play game like Conker's Bad Fur Day, we can actually turn on fast forward in this app, which goes up to 250% speed, and it'll go up to about 75 frames per second. And so yes, there is headroom here to allow you to be able to play these games at full speed, even in fast forward. So I would consider the AYANEO Pocket Air Mini to be a more than capable Nintendo 64 emulation device, provided that you're okay with using the standalone emulator over RetroArch, because there were a couple games here and there that didn't play at full speed when using RetroArch. It's a very similar story when it comes to playing Sega Dreamcast. The vast majority of these games will run just fine using the RetroArch core if you'd like to use that. And I know a lot of people prefer this one. They like to stay within that same ecosystem, so you have all the same hotkeys. It also has retro achievement support. And so if you want to have all of those little perks, then yes, most of the games are going to play just fine. To give you an idea of that performance upper limit, I would say that, games like Sonic Adventure 2, as well as Sega Rally 2, these ones play just fine within RetroArch. And these are some of the harder to play games on Dreamcast. So yes, the vast majority will play just fine. Some games like Crazy Taxi 2 and NBA 2K2, which I think is one of the hardest games to run on Dreamcast, these ones do play better in the Redream emulator, which is a standalone app. This one has really good auto frame skip, which smooths out the entire experience. And so if you are running into any problems in RetroArch with Dreamcast, then I would recommend using Redream. So as long as you don't mind hopping between the two as needed, I think that, again, Dreamcast is fully playable on this device, and these are all upscaled to that 960p resolution. Another system that is more or less playable on the AYANEO Pocket Air Mini is Sega Saturn, but there are a couple compromises. Number one, you're not going to be able to use the Beetle Saturn core, which is the most accurate core within RetroArch. This is going to look the best, but unfortunately, yeah, most of these games will not play at full speed. So instead, if you are going to stay within RetroArch, I would recommend using the Yabusan Shiro core, core, this one is going to be less accurate but more performant. And so again here, the majority of games will play at full speed if you use that Yabusan Shiro core, and then don't turn on any upscaling. You'll have to play these at the native resolution. Now personally, I've always liked the chunkiness of Sega Saturn when running at that native resolution, so not a big deal for me, but in general, this is kind of the performance that you can expect with Sega Saturn. There were some games that had slowdown even with this core. For example, Sega Rally Championship, one of the harder games to emulate on Saturn. This one unfortunately just did not play at full speed. It really tried and would get around 55 frames per second, but if you're looking for a perfect experience, this one really isn't it. So instead, I switched over to the standalone Yabusan Shiro app, and this one did play the game at full speed. And so yes, there is a way to play most of these games just fine, but again, like with some of these other apps, you may have to toggle between them to get the best performance. Now thankfully, front ends like Emulation Station make this actually very easy to toggle between different emulators and make it a seamless experience. So with Sega Saturn, I can just go in here, and if I look in the settings, so if I go into other settings and then go down to alternative emulators, you can see that under Sega Saturn, I have it set for Yabusan Shiro, which is the core within RetroArch. So by default, every game is going to run with the Yabusan Shiro core. For games like Sega Rally Championship, which do not run at full speed with the RetroArch core, we can change that to launch in a different app instead. So I can press select and then go down to edit this game's metadata and then go down to alternative emulator. And you can see here, I have it set to run with the Yabusan Shiro 2 standalone app instead. And so that's basically all you have to do. Now, when I launch any game, it's going to do the Yabusan Shiro core by default, but when I go back to Sega Rally Championship, it'll launch that standalone app instead. And so it's a seamless experience once you go through and make those changes. I've gone through all this stuff in my Emulation Station guides, but I wanted to give you a heads up that even though, yes, you may have to jump between different apps, you can actually have it set up in your front end to make it a seamless experience. Moving on from there, let's talk about handheld systems. We'll start with PlayStation Portable, and this one actually runs great. So I'm using the standalone app here, and then I just played everything at a 3x resolution. And this will cap out the resolution on this display, and it's also going to give you about 3.9 inches of screen real estate here with a 16:9 system running on a 4:3 display. Personally, I think it's right at the cusp of being playable for me in that I wish it was a little bit bigger, but I can still manage here. And so it's probably not the ideal way to play PSP just because it gets a little bit small playing 16:9 on a 4:3 screen, but in general, I would say it's just fine. I got a tiny bit of slowdown in God of War Chains of Olympus at a 3x resolution, so if you want a very smooth experience, you could maybe drop that down to a 2x resolution instead, but for the most part, yes, every PSP game that I tried played absolutely fine. It's a very similar story with Nintendo DS. I played all of these with the Melon DS standalone emulator at a 3x resolution, and everything played just fine here as well. Now, the DS was obviously a 2-screen system, and so what I typically will only do is play those games that work the best where I can only look at one screen at a time. And there are quite a few games that run just fine like this, and you don't need to see that secondary screen. And so, yes, you can play Nintendo DS games on it. It's probably not the ideal experience just because, nowadays we're getting 2-screen devices and whatnot, but if you are desperate to play some Nintendo DS games, it'll be just fine here. It's going to be pretty similar with Nintendo 3DS, but with additional caveats. You will be able to see one screen at a time, and this, may work well for some games, but other games may not. I personally just don't want to see 2 screens at once on a 4:3 display because it makes both of them too small. But again, if you are going to be playing single screen games, this should be just fine. Now, the other thing is performance is not quite there. Even if you put it in the max mode, it's still not going to play every game at full speed. I did a couple workarounds to make this work, so I'm using the Citra MMJ emulator, which has got a couple additional hacks and everything added to it, which reduces accuracy but does make it play a little bit better on low-end hardware. Even then, I had to cap it to a 2x resolution upscale just to make sure that I didn't get too many stutters, and when there were compilation stutters, you could definitely feel that too. So not a perfect experience by any means, given the fact that, we have to squish everything onto one screen and we have to make some compromises with the emulator, but if you are desperate to play some 3DS games, we do have performance that's good enough to play most of these games. games. So moving now into GameCube, this is the first system where I would say we are definitely hitting that upper limit, where the majority of games probably aren't going to play at full speed, even at a native resolution. Now, out of the box, there are going to be a few games that run just fine. Things like Crash Team Racing and NBA Street, and even Super Mario Sunshine is actually pretty decent on here. For all these games, I'm running them with the Vulkan backend, and then I'm just using the USA ROM, which means it's going to run at 60 frames per second. And yes, there are going to be some lighter weight games that'll play just fine at that native resolution. But as you move into harder to play games, using that Vulkan backend to play at full speed will cause some graphical issues on this Mali GPU. When you go into the ball form in Metroid Prime, you're not going to have that streak of light that usually will follow your character, and so this is just one of the many things that will be a compromise visually when using Vulkan with certain games. The performance also is not quite there. It's not playing at full speed, but if you tried to switch it over to OpenGL, you would get something that's more accurate and it would play a lot worse. A good example would be Mario Kart Double Dash. This is kind of a lightweight game, but when you try to play it in Vulkan, it's going to give you like a really dark screen and you can't see what's going on. So you have to use OpenGL instead. And unfortunately, when trying it with OpenGL, it cannot maintain a stable 60 frames per second. Instead, it's going to dip down to like 57 and 55, and you will feel those little stutters here and there. And so it's not a perfect experience, unfortunately. And then of course, there are going to be games that you cannot brute force, even with the Vulkan backend. Something like F-Zero GX is not going to play at full speed, and you're going to get some graphical issues as well. For example, the sky in this level in particular is overly bright. And so this is a texture issue right here. So the way I see it, probably less than half of the GameCube catalog is going to be fully playable at 60 frames per second using the Vulkan backend. Between the performance issues and the graphical issues, this is not a perfect system to use for emulation. So like I've mentioned with other devices, I would just consider Nintendo GameCube to be a nice to have, and that you might be able to play your favorite game, but you also may not be able to as well. It's the same story with PlayStation 2, and probably about the same level of performance, where about half the catalog you might find some success in actually playing a game at full speed at that native resolution. Same thing here, I'm using the Vulkan backend because that does give me better performance at the expense of some potential emulation accuracy, but yes, there are quite a few games that will play just fine. Now, if you've been emulating PS2 for a while, there are many games that you may expect to run well, and they do play great. Things like Final Fantasy X and the Maximo games and Katamari Damacy and Kingdom Hearts. These games have been developed for a long time, and so as a result, yes, they run pretty well. But I was surprised to find that other games that I would consider to be a little bit harder to run, things like Grand Theft Auto 3, actually played at full speed. And so again, like with GameCube, I would not consider this to be a playable system on this handheld, but you might be surprised where one of your favorite games plays well. Now, just keep it at the native resolution and try the Vulkan backend, and that's probably where I would start, and then maybe tweak it within the settings from there. Now, I don't want to oversell the performance potential here because there are plenty of PS2 games that are not going to play at full speed, and I was surprised to see which games in particular didn't run well. For example, Simpsons Hit and Run and Virtua Fighter 4 are kind of my go-tos when I want to make sure that games can play on a specific handheld, because these usually will run on everything, but I was surprised to find that they did not play at full speed. There were a bunch of others that I would consider to be a little bit harder to run, SSX 3 and Soul Calibur 2 and Tekken Tag Tournament. These also did not play at full speed either. I was getting about 75% speed. You may be able to go and make some emulation tweaks and hacks to get these to run, but out of the box, it's just not going to work. Now, if you want to jump in and try out some emulation hacks and tweaks, then yes, you may find some success. And God of War 2 is an easy example because all you have to do on this one, in most cases, is just turn on the underclocking. And this often will make the game play at around 60 frames per second, but it will introduce a lot of weird lag and timing issues. And so, yes, even though it says it's playing at 60 frames per second, it's still kind of a wobbly mess when you're actually playing it in the game. And so I personally don't like playing with this particular hack on, but if you're really just trying to play the game, this might be a solution for you as well. But for other games, even if you introduce some hacks, it may not be enough. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition is almost playing at full speed, but then it'll bog down quite a bit even with underclocking turned on. Same thing with other games like Devil May Cry 3 and Burnout Revenge. So you absolutely are not going to be able to play every single game at full speed without any significant tweaks with this system, but again, you might be able to play some PS2 games here and there, and that's always fun to explore. So putting it all together, my big takeaway here is that everything up through GameCube and PS2 is going to play just fine. You might have to do a couple tweaks here and there, but it's really just a matter of jumping into the right emulator for that particular game. Once you get into GameCube and PS2, you'll have to do heavier tweaks or maybe try out PAL versions of these games, which will only run at 50 frames per second, which generally will be easier to run on this system. And so that's basically the upper limit right there, is that you can play some PS2 and GameCube. Also, don't forget that because this is an Android-based system, you will be able to play Android games, but you are severely limited with that internal storage. So my recommendation here would be to, throw in a couple lightweight games, things that are going to have a small file size, like Stardew Valley or Horizon Chase. Like, these games are like a couple hundred megs each, so it's not going to take up a ton of internal storage, and it's always nice to have a couple Android games up your sleeve. Something like Genshin Impact is going to take up like your entire internal storage and probably won't run well either. And so, yes, I would stick to the lightweight Android games, but that's definitely possible too. Okay, I think that's enough for testing. Let's move on and talk about what I think of this AYANEO Pocket Air Mini. And, I got a lot of good and bad to say, and most of it is good. Number one is the build quality. Like I've mentioned a couple times already, it feels like a device that's more expensive than it actually is. It is kind of surprising to hold it in your hands and think, this thing is less than $100. The controls on this are pretty darn good. It's very D-pad centric, which means it's going to be more suited for playing retro games, but this chipset is also suited for that as well. So I think it's a good mix. I also like the screen on this device. It's 4.2 inches, which makes it pretty darn big when it comes to a 4x3 display, and it has a 960p resolution. And so in general, I think just in terms of the size and the resolution to work with, it's pretty good. The performance on these 4x3 classic systems is really good as well. We're able to play most things up through like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast with an upscaled 960p resolution, and it looks beautiful on this display. And when you put it all together into a price point that's under $100, I think we have a big winner here. The performance redefines what it means to be a budget handheld. For the longest time, if you saw a sticker price under $100, you knew exactly what to expect. That meant that it would play up to PS1 and maybe a few Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast games. But this one kind of flips it on its head where, yes, you can play Nintendo 64, yes, you can play Dreamcast, and they all run well on this big display. It really just caps out at PS2 and GameCube, and it's kind of surprising how many of those systems will play well too. Of course, it's not perfect, but I was surprised to find that I don't have a lot of nitpicks for this device either. So number one is the fact that we have a very saturated market. We've had sub $100 devices for a long time. And chances are, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you might already have a device at that sub $100 price point. And so that may not compel you to pick up something like this unless Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast is a really big draw for you. Instead, I see this device being more as a first introductory handheld and an easy recommendation for everybody else. Because if you don't have any handhelds at all and you're trying to buy something under $100 that has a 4x3 aspect ratio, then the AYANEO Pocket Air Mini is an easy recommendation. My only other hiccup with this device has to do with the shipping and the overall transparency of all of that. And all this really has to do with the platform they use for pre-ordering, which is Indiegogo. I wish that AYANEO just used their own website and then they charged you as well as your shipping right then and there, and, gave you options with PayPal and everything else. That's the ideal way to do it, and that's the way that most companies do it, but AYANEO tends to use crowdfunding for their pre-order campaigns, which just seems really odd. And recently, Indiegogo changed the way that they collect their pledges, and so now they don't collect any money until the end of the campaign, including the shipping fee. And so unfortunately, I'm not really sure what's going on in terms of shipping. I've heard that they're going to charge about $20 at the cheapest level, but still, I'm not really sure how much that's going to cost. And when we're talking about a budget handheld, things like shipping cost are very important. At least as a silver lining, if you do end up pledging for this device and then it comes down to paying for the shipping and it's above the price point that you're willing to pay, you can just cancel your order without having to pay anything. And so there is a little bit of assurance there in the fact that you're not going to get hit with a shipping charge that you don't agree with. But still, I'd love to have more transparency overall. So in the end, if you're wondering whether or not I recommend the AYANEO Pocket Air, I kind of just mentioned it a few minutes ago. I think that if you already have a sub $100 handheld, then it may not be worth upgrading to this one unless you really like the systems that can play on this that the other ones cannot. So Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and stuff like that. And if you're just starting out in the world of handhelds, you're looking for a nice compact 4x3 system under $100, then yes, this is the one to get, at least right now. And when it comes to sub $100 handhelds, we've had two really good entries over the past few months. Obviously the AYANEO Pocket Air that we're reviewing today, but then also the Mangmi Air X. This one also cost around $80 before shipping and has very similar performance between the two. I did a whole video about this one as well. I will leave it linked down below. And there are two big distinctions between these two. And number one is the display. This is a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is going to be great for things like PSP as well as, streaming if you want to do that, or widescreen hacks with Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. All that's going to work really well, and I show that off in my video. So if you're looking to play wider systems like PSP, then I think the Mangmi is still a better fit, but if you're wanting to focus on 4x3 gaming and something that's a little bit more compact, then that's where the AYANEO comes into play. The other thing that I think distinguishes between the two is the overall build quality, and I think that the Mangmi feels very good, but it is a bit cheap and plasticky overall compared to the AYANEO, which again I think just kind of punches above its weight class, and so this one feels more sleek and premium between the two. When it comes down to it, they are both really excellent handhelds and very easy to recommend. No matter what you get, I think you're going to be happy, but it really depends on what type of games that you're playing. If it's going to be 4x3 systems, then I would say that the AYANEO might be the better bet. Anyway, that's all I really got for the AYANEO Pocket Air Mini. This thing really surprised me. I expected it to have, some sort of fatal flaw, like some corner that they cut in order to make this price point, but no, this thing is solid and it's surprising how cheap it is. What really excites me about this device is that it has the potential to really shake up the sub $100 market. For the longest time, it was just an Anbernic market where, you pay around $70 or so, you get a device that does a pretty good job but has some obvious jank to it, but now we're getting something that's premium and sleek for a very similar price. And I really can't wait to see what kind of competition will come out later when Anbernic and other companies try to answer this one, because as it stands right now, this is kind of the gold standard in 4x3 systems under $100. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.